Hello, everyone. Thanks for joining us for the latest episode of Reimagined in America. I'm Karobi Acharya, and I lead the Global Ideas for U.S. Solutions team here at the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation. This is our 11th episode in the series. If you're returning to the series, welcome back. And for those of you joining us for the first time, we're thrilled to have you with us. I hope you have a chance to take the Blue Marble quiz, and if not, take it sometime after the webinar. It's super fun, and you'll learn something about it. The link is in the chat as well. So our team is charged with learning from the world and bringing back those lessons to help us improve health and well-being and build a culture of health in the United States. I'm your moderator today, and I'm going to facilitate a conversation with two amazing speakers. But before we begin, I want to take this opportunity to recognize and acknowledge that Philadelphia, where I'm based, is the ancestral lands of the Lenape people, also called Lenni Lenape, the traditional stewards of what is now Delaware, New Jersey, Eastern Pennsylvania, and Southern New York. The Lenape were the first tribe to sign a treaty with the United States. Despite many Lenape being forcibly removed from their ancestral homes and relocated to Western states, the Lenape's presence and resilience in Pennsylvania continues to this day. This land acknowledgement is one small act to pay respect and honor the caretakers of this land from time immemorial until now and into the future. Recognizing the histories of land theft, violence, erasure, and oppression that have brought us here. So now for a few quick reminders. We're using the Zoom webinar format. So while you're welcome to use the chat, we ask that you submit questions using the Q&A button on the bottom of your screen. And if you want to turn on live closed captioning, just select the live captions button also on the bottom of your screen. And I also want to invite you to an after party of sorts. We've always found that we're in the middle of a really robust conversation just as the webinar ends, but we know that many of you will need to drop off at 2 o'clock, but for the 2 o'clock Eastern. But those of you who may want to continue the conversation a little longer, we'll keep the line open for another 15 or 20 minutes and continue the Q&A with our speakers. So you're welcome to do that. Lastly, the webinar is being recorded, and everyone will receive an email in the next day or two with a link to that recording and the resources that we discussed today, and hope that you'll share it with others who might be interested. So I think it's fair to say that many working in health have not always seen the deep connections between our health and our environment, but we can no longer ignore that. In Michigan, for example, the centuries-long dumping of chemicals and trash into the Flint River exposed residents to high levels of lead. Or in California, where extreme drought and climate change have left farmers without enough water to grow food. It's clear that our health depends on the health of our environment and our rivers in particular. Indigenous peoples from across the globe have known this for generations. And today we'll hear how we can learn from, and more importantly, with tribal nations to build a more sustainable and healthy future. Their worldview and practices offer needed solutions for transforming our relationship with the rivers that give us life. So now, as is our tradition, I'm going to share a poll with you. We want to hear from all of you, and we have two questions that you should see on your screen. The first question is, do you know where your drinking water comes from? And I will admit, I had to look up where my drinking water came from. And if you scroll down, the second question is, why did you join today's webinar? So I'll give you a couple minutes to select your answer. And Kyle, just let us know when the results are ready.
We're at about 85% responding. I'll close the poll in about 15 seconds.
Great, thanks. All right, so let's see those results. So, well, 18% said no in terms of where their water comes from. That's better than what I expected. 46% of you know exactly where your water comes from. That's awesome. And 35% just had a vague idea. It seems like such a simple question, and yet I know for me, it feels distant, right? It goes through so many channels and mechanisms before it comes out of our faucet. Why did you join today's webinar? 83% want to know more about how Indigenous people are advancing health equity. 48% looking for solutions you can bring to your own community. And 50%, I want to understand what others can learn, what we can learn from other countries, which is great. All fantastic reasons. So with that, let's just dive into the conversation. And let me introduce our two amazing speakers. So Alina Kawe is the CEO of Red Star International and is an Indigenous health leader and advocate with more than 25 years of experience working with communities to transform their aspirations into action. In 2018, she received national recognition for developing the first public health institute in the United States, focusing solely on Indigenous well-being. Alina is also an enrolled member of the Texas Band of Yaqui Indians. Armenia Frias is currently serving in her second consecutive term as tribal council for the Pascua Yaqui tribe. And in 2004, she was honored to serve as chairwoman. She has over 20 years of experience with Indigenous governance, policy, management, and development. Please turn your videos on and welcome to you both. So I'm going to kick things off with a few questions of my own, and then we'll answer questions from the audience. And remember, you can submit a question at any time by clicking on the Q&A button on the bottom of your screen. So let's begin. So Alina, you've been working to connect Indigenous communities across the globe as a way to inform efforts in the US that are aimed at improving health and the environment. Can you tell us a little more about what you've been doing? How did it start? And what have you learned?
Yes, good afternoon, everyone. Thanks for having me today. Well, I've always been interested in international Indigenous health. And in 2000, I had a unique opportunity. I was one of 3 Native Americans who traveled to Australia to be part of a professional Indigenous exchange. And I had the opportunity to visit Aboriginal communities and health clinics and talk with them about their health efforts. And it was such a positive experience to be able to travel across the world and visit another community and share this common worldview. We had similar challenges, but it was in the differences that we had in our approach that really sparked new ideas, and that had a big impression on me and my work. And so through our work at Red Star, we've taken a similar approach in facilitating tribe to tribe knowledge sharing and learning with one another in the US. And so we've taken those successful practices and brought it to the international space. And so most recently, we facilitated an Indigenous knowledge exchange between tribes in Arizona and Wanganui in New Zealand. So back in February 2020, we took tribal leaders representing 4 tribes, and we traveled down to the Wanganui River to experience the river firsthand through the eyes of its people. And it was an incredible experience because for over 150 years, the tribes there had fought to protect their river. And in 2017, the New Zealand government passed unprecedented legislation and recognizing the river as a living entity with the right to be healthy. And so effectively, they legislated an Indigenous worldview and values. And back home, our Colorado River Basin is in trouble. We're in serious drought and water shortage. So this exchange was really an opportunity for us to explore the health and healing of our rivers through an Indigenous lens.
Great, thanks so much. Armenia, you were part of this exchange, traveling to New Zealand to learn about how the Maori people that live along the river are healing the river. Tell us a little bit, what was that experience like for you, and how did it impact the way you think or do things back home?
Well, I was, the Basquiat tribe was one of, I think there were five tribes, maybe 4 that went, but we're one of 22 tribes in Arizona. And I was honored to be one of the tribes that was invited to this exchange. And I think one of the biggest learning takeaways was just to be with the Wanganui people and to learn from them about their challenges, but also their successes in how it is that they were able to grant this river personhood, but also how it is that they use their traditional ways and their traditional values in working with the non-Indigenous people to help them understand how important it is for them to protect this river, and how important it is for everyone to understand that this river affects everyone, and the impact that this river has to the entire ecosystem. And so when we were there, I think one of the biggest impact the biggest takeaway that I had, and I think probably for most of us, if not all of us, was, when the saying of I am the river is me. And that was because it was all about the ecosystem and about keeping that river clean, because it does feed into the ecosystem. It feeds into the plants, it feeds into the animals, and it feeds into the people. And in order to keep that river healthy and clean, it's going to keep the people healthy and clean. And it's a responsibility of the steward, of the people there to do that. And so it also gave me a different perspective of how we think about maintaining and working with our water systems instead of trying to manage it, instead of managing it like we sometimes try to do here. And I think that's because here in the United States and how we have been, because of the policies that we have here now in Arizona, and we have our water rights and everybody has a piece of the pie, and it's just, you have your water rights settlement, you have your water rights settlement, and you get this much and you get that much, that there's that whole divide and conquer concept. But at the end of the day, you can't keep one piece of one portion of the water clean. That's not going to affect the entire ecosystem, and it's not going to affect the entire community. So
Right.
that was very powerful to think about. It's everyone's responsibility, but you have an entire Indigenous people that is taking on the responsibility. And so that takeaway of I am the water is me, really resonated. And it resonated, I think, with all of us about how do we really think bigger and continue to think bigger, which we do, but flip that here in the States, and flip that here when we're working on these types of policies where they haven't been set up that way.
Yeah.
you
Yeah.
know, and I know it was a challenge there, but understanding with them of how did you overcome those types of challenges?
Right, right. So I want to share a short clip from the exchange. Alina, you were working with a filmmaker to produce an incredibly powerful movie about this, and I want to show the trailer for it now. The photography is stunning, and look forward to the full film.
Our river is ill. And when the water becomes sick, we become sick. It's not good.
What we were really doing is trying to give legal expression within the paradigm of a European-based legal system to the kawa, the values that go back through many generations.
It's about ensuring and instilling a sense of responsibility across the whole of our community.
This is the most that I've ever been around water and in the water. And, you know, the atmosphere here, the people are so humbling and loving.
It just shows the health of the river is reflective on the health of the people. You know, every part of the generations that are there know who they are and know what their responsibility is as caretakers of the Wanganui River.
To articulate our own customary laws, our own practices, and there being a response to that. That to me is what has happened here in New Zealand.
We have to start taking a different viewpoint of the Colorado River.
We always think about reclamation, but how do we go back and heal the river? How do we still heal from where we are now?
Can't wait to see the full thing. I think it's going to be incredible. So, Alina, you spoke about how an indigenous sort of tradition has become law now in New Zealand, thanks to the efforts of the Maori people. Can you give us some other examples of other places where indigenous practices, cultural norms, or policies have been institutionalized? You know, sort of what else can we learn from indigenous peoples of the world to improve health and well-being?
Yeah, well, I think it's really important to recognize that indigenous people contribute the least but are impacted most by the colonial practices of extraction, climate change, and so on. And we also know, and there's growing evidence, that lands that are stewarded and managed and cared for by indigenous people are healthier. So we know that this is very practical and is an indigenous movement that's really happening in multiple places. And so the Wanganui River is one of those, but really where it started was in Ecuador when they acknowledged the rights of nature in their constitution. So you have a whole nation governing under these values, indigenous values. You've seen the movement also in terms of personhood and rivers in India with the Ganges River, but also tribes have taken similar action in the US. The White Earth, Anishinaabe in the Midwest have practiced, have done rights of nature around their wild rice. You've seen also the city of Toledo actually voted to give Lake Erie the rights of personhood as well. So it's a big movement that's happening, and a lot of people tend to focus on the personhood aspects. But really, what's most important, I think, about these movements is that they're really grounded in having relationship with understanding our relationship with the environment. And moving away from focusing on private ownership, extraction, profit, controlling nature, like Councilwoman Frias had talked about, and working to live in relationship with it. So I think it's in reconciling the differences between that ownership and how indigenous people see it, because the land doesn't belong to us, we belong to it. And we also have a responsibility to care for the future of the environment, not just for ourselves, but for our grandchildren and for our grandchildren's grandchildren. So it becomes really important that we understand that entire ecosystems depend on the health of our rivers, and not just the water that you see, the whole watershed, the aquifers, and we're part of that ecosystem. And so it really is important that we look to that. And while I think the tendency and what I sometimes see is sort of this romantic, people romanticizing Indigenous values and beliefs as being maybe mystical or spiritual. And we do have a spiritual connection as given to us through our creation stories and through our cultural narratives that help guide that relationship. But it's also very practical. And it had to be because our survival depended on it. And so what we're seeing across these different practices are some very practical steps that have occurred. And one is creating a space to privilege Indigenous values and principles, moving away from just extraction to sustainable practices, taking the time to listen and to learn and reconcile our differences, and moving into a space of what I would call shared governance, where we're actually governing together and putting the health of the river first. So this whole idea of from the mountains to the sea, that we're looking at our river systems from its very source to its completion into the ocean. And that's what connects us. We're all connected by our rivers.
Yeah,
Through the
yeah.
ocean.
Thank you. So powerful, and it really is. It is a whole mindset shift, right? About how we are related and how we think about the river and other natural resources. And I like your point about it being pragmatic and needing to be pragmatic. And on that note, Armenia, I would love to hear from you about, what advice do you have for local U.S. communities and policymakers who are interested in working with Indigenous people to improve health, equity, and the climate on a practical basis? What advice would you give folks?
Mm-hmm. Well, I think we have to, first of all, I think it's really good that you started with the land acknowledgement, because I think we have to acknowledge the land that we're now living on and the development that has happened. Because I think with development and progress, there has also been impacts to that development. And part of the impact has been, what has happened to the water table, and how has that impacted our communities. And I'll give you an example of our traditional communities that still exist in Rio Yaqui in Mexico, and how that development has poisoned the waters of our Rio Yaqui. And, because of development and because of the dams that have been created, that river doesn't flow anymore as it used to flow. And the water that does flow is now toxic. And so people, rather than drinking that water, and that water that used to flow into the crops, it's full of toxins. And so it has real health effects to that community, to people, to the ecosystem. And that's real. When you have a community that will drink soda because it's non-toxic compared to water from that river, you have a problem. And so development isn't necessarily development when you have a toxic water system. And so those are the kinds of things that we have to pay attention to when we're talking about development, is who is it going to impact and where is that balance? And so we'll have to have those conversations of that land acknowledgement. And when we see a space and we see dollar signs, or we see a building going up, or we see progress and potential, we have to think about how is that going to impact people? How is that going to impact the future? And, you know, think along the lines of balance, because it will have an impact. And we have to think about the future. The other thing is, you know, as tribes living here, as Indigenous people living here, you know, the consultation policy. Are there consultation policies in your states? You know, I know this is a wide audience.
Can you
In
just
Arizona,
explain for folks who may not know what a consultation policy is?
so when there is a development that is happening around water, around any type of a new development, there is a consultation policy through the United States that will consult with tribes on a new type of initiative that is going to happen with the administration, that will consult with the tribes. Some states have it, and some states don't. Some states have it and don't enforce it, and some states don't. And some states have it and it's just on paper. And so it's up to, you know, does it exist and doesn't exist, or I don't know if it exists or not, but it's really important that that the tribes are at the table to know what is happening around when there's development. And, you know, in Arizona, when we're talking about our water rights and we're talking about water rights settlements, there are people sitting around the table that are, I believe, that are conflicting to the interest of water, like companies that are negotiating with tribes that have responsibilities to citizens, to people that are trying to negotiate water rights. You know, why would you have a mining company sitting at the table, or industry sitting at the table, or any kind of a business when a tribe is trying to negotiate a water right on behalf of their people?
Right. You know, on that note, we're about to turn over to the audience questions. So audience, please enter your questions in the Q&A function. But before we get to that, I just had one last question, really building on what you were just saying, Armenia. This is to both of you. You know, I think you both talk about this distinction between learning with Indigenous communities as opposed to learning from. And could you maybe both quickly just address what that distinction is? Armenia, if you want to start, because that I think is really where you were going with what you were saying. You know, and if you have, you know, suggestions, advice to ensure that it is with and not from.
Yeah, and that really is the consultation, is really having that dialogue, and that is learning with, having that dialogue where it is back and forth, and you really have an agreement of this is consultation. We are having a dialogue. This is what we agreed upon, and it isn't a one-way conversation of you signed in, we told you that we were going to go drill, or we were going to go do this, and now you know what we're doing. That is not learning or nothing. So it has to be a real learning. And, you know, that's not learning. I'm not learning from you. You're not learning from me.
Right. Alina, did you want to add into that before we turn to the audience?
Yeah, I think it can be both. And I think it depends on where you are in the learning process. And like for us with the exchange, and we were, you know, initially it was looking at, well, what can we learn from the experience of the Wanganui tribes and what has occurred here in New Zealand? And from our perspective as an Indigenous-led organization, you know, we can't just go and say, we want to learn from you. It's again, it's very, it becomes extractive. And so in that sense, we said, well, if we're going to do this, let's have this be an exchange. And we have very specific principles that guide that. And the first and foremost is respect for tribal sovereignty. We respect their sovereignty and their inherent right to determine their future. So respecting them as tribes, we went there and asked the question, we're interested in creating a space where we can learn from one another. Is this of interest to you? And then the second one was to prioritize local knowledge, values, and practices. So as visitors, we went there as, as visitors and respected that position that we held. And in that sense, we were there to listen. We were there to listen, to understand, and to learn to them, and not to go there and start to assert, well, this is how we do it. And so through that process, we then focused on the collective will. What are the things that we share? What are our shared aspirations? And began to establish that relationship, but also a sense of relational accountability to one another, to respect that knowledge that was shared. So unfortunately, due to the pandemic, we haven't completed the exchange with the reciprocal visit, but that's what is planned when it's safe, if we hope that we can carry that through. But I think that that's kind of the distinction between from and with. It can be subtle, but then once you get into consultation and you have that, everyone sitting at the table, then we're learning with each other. We're making decisions together because we've established those foundations and not just looked at principles as a list, but we're in a place of implementing those principles in practice.
Yeah. I think what you're describing really has a lot to do with sharing power as well. So we have a number of questions coming in from the audience, and keep them coming. We'll try to get to as many as we can. This first one I'm intrigued by, and the question is, does the difficulty and differences in defining water make translating practices from one place to another more difficult? Would anyone like to start with that? The idea of defining water.
I have some thoughts about that. I think it's a worldview perspective around how we define and think about water as it relates to any water source. And so if we're looking at it as a commodity, as an infinite source, and we're looking at as, okay, we've got this commodity and we want to share it amongst the farmers, the miners, the cities, and we're doing all of that, then we're not sort of taking a perspective of one looking at it as a living entity, as being an entire ecosystem. We're just looking at what we can see, what we can use, and how it can benefit us. And so part of that moving to sustainability is reconciling those worldview differences. And that's where that listening to understand becomes really important. And if you don't have those perspectives at the table, Councilwoman Frias mentioned this, was that, you have all these policies being made. The Colorado River is one of the most legislated rivers in the world. And you have people making decisions, and the tribes, there's 30 tribes with historic ties, and they've never been a part of that conversation. And yet their knowledge of that river system goes back millennia. So if you don't have those diverse perspectives at the table, then we're, never going to be able to move forward in a good way. So maybe that's a good place to start, is what is our understanding of water? How are we looking at it, and how can we reconcile it? Because I don't think it's realistic to go back to this idea of it, the river being this pristine vision of what it was. It's not about going back to the past, but how do we let it flow in its fullest expression and water our crops, bring waters to the city. But these use it or lose it policies don't do anybody any good.
Yeah, yeah. Thanks, Alina. Next question. How do advocacy efforts extend to the corporate and military sectors who use the rivers and waterways to integrate responsible practices into the use of rivers and waterways? Armenia, I don't know if you want to start with that. I imagine you deal with this quite a bit, sort of corporate and military sectors. You want to talk about that?
Yes. I think when tribal leaders hear the word Army Corps of Engineers, we cringe. Because there has been a long, long history of bad outcomes when it comes to Army Corps of Engineers because of federal policies. And so I think that, and it's, you know, and there are federal policies that have been enforced through the Army Corps of Engineers. Let's dam this, let's dam that, and entire reservations have been flooded. So I think it's really important that it goes back to tribal consultation at the federal level with the tribes to ensure that they understand what the role, that we have this conversation. And I think that we have this conversation. And we have advocacy groups at the federal level to have these conversations about water, to have these conversations about these types of impact at the federal, at the states, that trickle at all levels, so that we know this. So, because there, like I said, there have been entire populations that have been flooded out and that have been dammed. So it's
yeah.
But there have been things too, you know. So I mean, it's just, but it's a cringing every time you hear it.
Yeah. So just I'm gonna kind of ask one with these questions. I'll pitch it to one of you, but if either of you want to,
can I say something that
Sure,
I didn't get to say earlier?
Yeah.
One thing that I did want to mention is, you know, when we're talking about what we can learn is from, you know, most recently, you know, from the president from Mexico acknowledged the atrocities that have happened to the indigenous people of Mexico. And he went out to all of the indigenous people of Mexico, and he was out in Rio Yaqui just on Tuesday and met with the indigenous pueblos of Mexico, of Rio Yaqui, and did a formal apology and talked about, you know, water and health, and, you know, how he was going to invest in potable water and invest in, you know, irrigation and invest in, you know, and it was what Alina was talking about, you know, because there's some things that are going to look different. You know, there's a certain amount of reclamation that you can do, but it's going to look different because the environment is different. You know, global warming is real. And the damage that we have done because of development is real and irreversible to some point in certain areas. So I just want to put that out there.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for mentioning that. Alina, I'll toss this question to you. This is, I love this question. So although it is a much needed step forward, is there something about using a European rights-based framework which seems somewhat limiting? For example, given how hard it is to even enforce human rights for humans, if you were to push this paradigm farther and in deeper alignment with indigenous values of nature, such as we belong to nature and there's no separation, what would this look like? And I would love, Elena, maybe for you to start, and then Armenia, if you want to chime in.
Well, I think one thing that's important to note is that personhood and rights of nature is one pathway, and but I think that it has to start with I think each indigenous community, because we're not all the same. We're very diverse. And we have diverse relationships. And even if you look at the 30 tribes that have historical ties to the Colorado River Basin, that relationship that each tribe has with the river is unique to them. And so when we're looking at these practices, I think that there are other pathways that it can emerge, because we do have those traditional laws and practices that guide our relationship, and our systems reflect our values. And so I think for me, I wouldn't necessarily say that personhood is the right pathway for any river, but I think it's for each indigenous group with their different partners, whether it be local, state, it's for them to identify that pathway forward and to look to the values that guide that, that ecosystem, that particular area. And so how do we begin to map those values and then put them into practice in our decision making? It's a very complex question. I don't know if I probably just barely scratched the surface, but I do think we have to look to the people of the area, of the region, for those pathways.
Well said, well said. Armenia, did you want to chime in on that question, or shall I move to the next? Okay. All right, let's see. So the next question is it better to protect land by making more land public, or are there situations where privately owned land might be a better option? I don't know who feels like they could speak to that.
I think what's challenging about even that conversation at its very root is that traditional lands were essentially, ceded to the US government as part of the colonization process and put into trust. And in many cases, those have become our public lands. Our national parks are a perfect example of that. So in this sense, lands that were held and cared for and stewarded have been made public to privilege another group's personal experience and hiking and rafting and all of those things over the people and the original stewards. So I think when we talk about public spaces, public lands and privately owned land, we're still kind of looking at it through that really colonized lens. And we have to kind of think about, are we talking about public parks in a city? Are we talking about rural areas? So I think, again, the complexities become very specific to place. And I think when we're talking about Indigenous knowledge, it's very connected to place. And so whether it's public, private, or given back to the tribes to care for, it becomes a very loaded, I doubt it was intended to be a loaded question, but it can be, and it warrants a whole new webinar, I think.
Yeah.
So I'll just leave it at that. I don't know if Councilwoman Frias has anything to add.
Yeah, I agree.
Yeah. Armenia, let me ask you the question that I think is on a lot of our minds, and I'm wondering about your experience in Arizona, but how can non-natives support tribal sovereignty and water rights? Non-natives, how can we support those issues? And do you have examples where non-native groups have been supportive of indigenous-led efforts?
Well, I think it's always just important. I think it's important to understand tribal sovereignty. I think one way is just to educate yourself that tribes are sovereign. And I think a lot of people don't understand that tribes are sovereign nations, and we have our own government, and we are responsible for our tribal citizens, and we have jurisdictions, and we run healthcare centers, and we run schools, and we have police departments, and we run a whole entire government. And so therefore, when we advocate for healthy environments and for healthy water and what is that we do, we're doing it because we're sovereign. And so supporting us by understanding who we are as sovereigns, I think that's very important. We're not just a social group, we're a political entity. And so I think that's very important for people to understand. And so I think that by educating yourself that there are, I think now 576 tribes throughout the country is a good start, because like I said, a lot of people just think, who are these tribes who are these people that are just a group of people? We're not. We're sovereigns, and we're responsible for our people, and I think that's a good start.
Yeah. I think many of us feel that we were just not adequately educated about the history of our own country and of these issues. And I think, I agree, just starting with understanding some of that history and what took place and how it's very different often from the stories many of us have been told. So yeah, thank you for that.
Can I just add something to that? Because Councilwoman Frias had talked about tribal consultation policies that exist at the federal and in many states, those different levels. And whether your state has a consultation policy or not, have a look at those policies, because in those policies are specific practices often outlined on how to engage tribes in conversation. And it doesn't matter if you're a policymaker or you are working in a local health department or delivering health promotion programs, there's a way to engage in tribal consultation policies at every level. And tribal consultation refers to something very specific, but you can go through consultative processes. You can use that to guide so that it's not just engagement, but you're actually moving to that place of getting together. Because I think sometimes engagement is, you can bring people to the table and then they leave. They've been engaged. But how do you engage in meaningful consultative processes from the beginning that actually establish long-term relationships? And that's where we can be allies in this work.
Right. And and Alina's right, because it's not just at the state level, it really is expanding to, the county level and with schools and with, at every single level that we are expanding these policies so that we have these meaningful relationships through intergovernmental agreements, through memorandums of understandings, through whatever sort, so that we can build better relationships and we can work better together. Because I'll give you an example with COVID-19, this virus doesn't discriminate between, who's a tribal citizen and who's who lives outside the reservation. It is our responsibility for us to take care of each other, no matter where you live. And so it was a regional plan for us to ensure that everybody was protected. And so just like with water, just like with everything, it's our responsibility to work together to take care of each other. So regional planning, regional development, regional, all of this, the tribe does a really good job working with everybody just to make sure that this whole area is taken care of, because we're not on an island.
Right.
So we
Right.
have to take care of each other.
Right. There's actually a related question on this, which is, what have been your experiences of interactions with non-Indigenous members of the scientific community, specifically ecological and environmental sciences? I'm curious what your experience has been with non-Indigenous members of that community.
Well,
Yeah. go ahead.
yeah, I'll start. I think it's actually, I was going to touch on that when you asked that other question too, when you asked how they can help. I think that's one of the important things too, is because we have a intergovernmental or a independent institutional review board. So ensuring, with research, with science and with research, whenever anybody wants to come and do research, because people or scientists or whomever is curious, or sometimes it is good research that the tribe is interested in doing. It's not something that you can just come over and say, hey, I have this project. We have a very sophisticated system here at the Pascua Yaqui tribe. We have a lot of great people that are working here. We have Attorney General, we have, we've got a good system here. We don't run a mom pop show here. And a lot of tribes have really worked hard to build up their governance systems and their institutions to ensure that we are protected. And so we make sure that people want to come and do research, or they're interested in looking at our environment or looking at our soil or looking at, our air quality or looking at our water system. We're just as interested too, but we want to make sure that the people that are coming and doing this are credentialed, knowledgeable, that they're not some phony that is just, collecting data or information or trying to take us on a ride, because we've seen that, so there's, we've seen that too. So
Yeah.
there have been times that, people may believe that tribes are not, may not know what's going on, but we do. We've got a lot of great people that we work with, and our tribal leadership is on top of it. So yeah, we're just as knowledgeable and just as eager to know what's going on in our environment. So we want those right people out here too, to help us ensure that we've got the resources we need.
Mhm. Right. Thank you. Next.
Can I add something?
Sure.
I'm sorry,
Please.
because
Yeah,
I
yeah.
think I want to just compliment what Councilwoman Frias said, because I think at the end of the day, Indigenous people are scientists. And I think that that's kind of where the fundamental conflict lies when ecological scientists meet with Indigenous people, is they see their knowledge systems as science, but they don't see Indigenous knowledge systems as science. And the science within Indigenous knowledge systems is from, again, millennia of observation, knowledge of the impact of lunar cycles on the ecosystems, when to harvest, when not to. There's all different And those things are transmitted through language, through culture, all of those different things. So I think that that tends to be one of the biggest barriers, in addition to the ones that she mentioned, is that if the knowledge systems that are coming together are not respected, or one is privileged over another, which is what we continue to see, those power structures, and at every level, even in these types of conversations, we're never going to sort of break through, because, you know, it's that Western science that has gotten us to the situation that we are in now, where we can genetically modify this, we can move the water from here over to there. And it doesn't matter that they've used all the water sources. We'll just keep pumping more water from over here over there so that they can still keep living the way they're living, and not forcing people to make change.
Yeah. Well, we are coming up on the 2:00 Eastern hour. And I want to kind of offer a little bit of a closing for people who may need to jump off. But as I said at the beginning, we are having an after party. So if you can stay around, please stay around. We'll keep the conversation going for a little bit longer. There's still a number of questions that we haven't gotten to. If you do need to jump off, please just fill out the very, very short survey that's going to pop up on your screen when you sign off. We really do take the feedback very seriously. And as I said, we'll make the recording available to everyone in the next couple days and share it with anyone. So with that, let's turn back to questions. We were right in the middle of this conversation, and what you were starting to say, Alina, actually speaks to one of the questions that we've gotten in, which is what are the hosts and speakers' recommendations on valuing traditional ecological knowledge? So much management and planning is done by people who have PhDs or masters in land use planning, habitat management, regional and local planners. Even the degree program titles are not inclusive of Indigenous perspectives of nature. So exactly what you were saying. I don't know if there's anything either you'd like to add.
Yeah, I mean, I think that was the main point. I think that we were trying to make, is that it's not just the degree holders, but it's actually our elders and learned people in our communities who hold a PhD in our traditional knowledge, and the communities know who those people are, and those things are earned over time, and there's a lot of responsibility that comes with that. And so learning to respect and look to that knowledge. But I think what also tends, we have to be really careful, because Indigenous people are also among the most exploited. Our knowledge is exploited. So, sometimes we'll form those partnerships, and the researchers will come in, and that trust is built, and that knowledge is shared. And then it's published in a paper and becomes their knowledge, because they were the ones that collected it through interviews and recorded it, and then the first one to report it in publication. And so again, you sort of have this conflicts around what is knowledge, who owns knowledge, and that's where that relational accountability comes. So we spent that time on the river, and you saw we were in the canoes, we were in cultural and ceremonial spaces. We have a responsibility to that knowledge that was shared with us. And we cannot speak on behalf of the people. We can speak to our experiences, but we are accountable to that knowledge. We were in a very privileged space. So we, even in our exchange, we have guiding principles of how we talk about the project and how we communicate about it with the public. And there are sometimes, and then what comes with that is when the tribe says no, no means no. So you have to respect that as well. And, sometimes people don't like to be told no when they think that, oh, well, so many people could benefit from this. It's not yours to share. So it's being in that willingness to step into space with with our communities, and understand the responsibility that comes with knowledge sharing, and then what can be shared or what is appropriate to share, and then how it's shared and with whom.
Yeah, thank you so much for saying that. I'll just add in that, you know, I think as a funder, it's been really valuable for us to enter into those conversations as well, with, you know, hopefully a bit of humility and understanding that no, it's not our story to share either. You know, so just understanding that, and I think that's just an important stance for any funder to take, to recognize that, you know, exactly your point, whose story it is to tell. Armenia, let me ask you this next question. Are there any particular tribal consultation policies or approaches that you think work especially well?
No. You know, I think they're trying to figure it out. I say that in jest because we're actually, you know, I think that the fact that, first of all, there is a formal consultation policy is a huge step in the federal government. So that is a huge step. That did not exist until 1997. So, you know, to me, that just seems like yesterday, you know, considering the fact that, you know, how long, you know, tribes have been sovereign. So that is big. I think what it is that consultation looks different to each tribe. And so that is where the particulars come into place. And so because there are so many different tribes, it can look very different to what, for us as the Pascua Yaqui tribe, what could be consultation. So I think what's important, that's why I say no, is because I sat with a lot of tribal leaders in a room, and I can feel like we had a good meeting with, say, a school board, and or let's say, you know, a superintendent. I could feel like I had a good meeting, and, you know, another person will feel like that wasn't a true consultation. Because maybe they didn't get the same type of whatever it is, what they were planning on getting out of that meeting. So I think what's important is that whomever is on the other end giving that consultation, whether it's the school, whether it's, you know, the Department of Health and Human Services, whether it's the governor's office, whether it's, you know, that for them to really work with the tribe to figure out that meaningful consultation. And are they getting to that place where they're making progress? And not assume because you sat in a meeting with 20 tribal leaders or 576 that you can check the box under tribal consultation, because it's going to look different. And because it's going to look different. And it doesn't work when you have a room full of tribal leaders. And this is how it's worked a lot of times, for the sake of efficiency.
Yeah.
Where you just get a bunch of tribal leaders in a room representing a lot of tribes, and you talk about a new regulation or policy and say, I'm just consulting on you, you know, this is what's going to be coming down the pipeline. And then you just check the box. It's not true consultation. It's not meaningful consultation. But if you were to really have that conversation with the tribe, then you could really know whether or not it's working.
Yeah. Thanks for that. Couple more questions here. Okay. Maybe Alina, if you want to start with this one. So the question is, part of enshrining a reciprocal relationship to nature in Western legal frameworks seems partly about mitigating the growing financialization to nature. So have there been economic development or wealth building concerns by Indigenous peoples where the rights of nature have been implemented? And let me know if I need to read that again. You're muted. Yeah.
Yeah, if you could, or I could try to find it, but yeah, could you read it one more time?
Yeah, sure. So part of enshrining a reciprocal relationship to nature in Western legal frameworks seems to be about mitigating the growing financialization to nature. Have there been economic development or wealth building concerns by Indigenous peoples where the rights of nature have been implemented?
So maybe I'm not completely, there's some of the language that I'm tripping up on in the very last part in terms of have there been, are we looking for examples of where that's?
Yes, so examples, at least as I understand it, examples where Indigenous people have engaged in economic development or wealth building, but have also included sort of a rights of nature framework or, you know, basis to that economic development. That's at least how I'm understanding it.
Okay. Well, I don't know much about it. I've actually been learning more about some of the activities that the Gila River are leading. But I think that, you know, with some of that, you know, the part that I may be having a little bit of in terms of coming up with specific examples where there's been economic, because I feel like that's quite specific. And because if the tribes aren't at the table, I mean, tribes do have economic interests also connected with nature, and those economic interests can tie with the economic interests of a city or a county or a state, or even the federal government. And so I don't know if I have a specific example to rattle off, but for some reason, and I don't think it's an economic interest, but could be seen potentially as maybe having some economic benefit. It was the recent, what's happening with the Yurok tribe and the Klamath River and the way that they've been able to actually remove dams and regenerate the flow of the river, which is bringing back the life of the salmon, which is central to their culture. And I don't think there was necessarily an economic interest in that, or more of a cultural one really driving that. But when we think about, I mean, then you have to also decolonize your thinking about economics, because when you can, you know, when there is an abundance of your traditional foods in your food systems, you're able to feed your people, which has a huge economic impact on the community. So, you know, that's probably the best I can offer on the spot without doing some deeper thinking. But, you know, those are examples of, again, that's why that knowledge, Indigenous knowledge, how we don't kind of separate all those things. They all kind of are interrelated and connected.
Yeah. Thank you. Thank you for that. I do think, going back to that question about how non-natives can support, I think, you know, understanding that it is a very different worldview. It is a very different set of meanings and cultural concepts. And there is tremendous value in trying to understand that and absorb that and use that in our own work.
And I think it's how those stories get told in the media as well. So how we're learning about the efforts of Indigenous people. It's great to see a greater presence in the media, but it's still often sort of told from with the emphasis on the sacred, which is important, but it also has sort of these other values as well, like I just mentioned, in terms of it being a primary food source and an economic interest for the people. And so I think there are also efforts that can be made even in how we share those stories. And I was just reading about the Klamath and the Yurok, and even this one little sentence stood out because the way the author had written it was that their belief is that they emerged from that river. Their creation story is tied to that river. But the way it was worded was as if it was their belief, whether it's true, you know, kind of putting this like whether it's true or not, because that sounds like a myth or, you know, it's a creation story versus this is where they emerged. This is where they come from as a statement of fact. So, you know, those are different examples too of how we can kind of begin to decolonize our thinking when we're also reading about these things.
Yeah, so important. And maybe we can find a link or two about that story that we can share after the webinar, because I'm sure people will be interested to see that. And Alina, you've used the word decolonize our thinking and decolonization. And I just thought maybe for folks who are not familiar with that term, could you just share a little bit about what that means and how you're using it?
Yeah, well, if you think about, I mean, it goes all the way back to the doctrine of discovery, that basically all of the, you know, from the beginning of colonizing, it was about that until we've discovered it, it's all new land. It's vacant. It's there for our taking, and that really is the foundation and of our governance for in the U.S. even. And in fact, I don't think it was long ago where Ruth Gator, I'm saying her name wrong, Ginsburg, cited the doctrine. Yes, she cited the doctrine of discovery in a court case against the tribe, saying, well, that based on the doctrine of discovery, this can happen. So it's still very, very relevant today in terms of how our legal system, how decisions are made. And so it's kind of looking at our colonial settler history. And I think it's in learning what that history is, and then how can we begin to sort of carve out a new way to kind of say, oh, okay, this land that we're like with the land acknowledgement, the land that we're on was not ours. It was stolen. It was, you know, so how do we begin to understand that and create policies that are done in collaboration, that are done and that ensures a sustainable future, and sort of reconcile our thinking around those things? Because again, our values, our systems reflect our values. So as long as our systems are creating and reinforcing marginalization, are continuing to reinforce inequities in our health, in our education, in our housing, then it's still that same privileging one group of people over another.
Thank you. So I think we'll wrap up with one last question, and then we'll close. So this last question, and you know, I think it's a challenging question, but I think it's a really important question, which is this: policy and legislation are crucial, and yet in the U.S. context, at least, it is so corrupted and paralyzed, our policy and legislative system. To what extent can we make progress through alternatives to policy? And for example, they give by educating and encouraging individuals, farmers, businesses to use less water, but I would imagine even beyond that. So alternatives to policy change, given how challenging that is. And maybe I'll give that first to the elected official among us, Arvidia, and then Alina, you could comment as well.
So the alternative to policy and legislation, so without somebody telling you what to do? So without the stick,
Yeah, I mean, I
uh,
think it's just recognizing how challenging, particularly in
right.
the US context,
Well,
policy
because
change
some,
is, right?
right? Because sometimes people interpret that as a stick, right? Because some people, I think, will automatically feel, yeah, it's a stick. And some might not. I'm a policy person. So I think part of it is, I believe, is that education part of it. It really is that education part of it, and thinking holistically, about where are we going to be in the future, in future planning, and also being realistic about who's in for the long haul, because we all have to do our part, and we all have to think about our resources. They're not all renewable. There's irreversible damage that we are doing. So there are things that we have to think about, and we have to be responsible. And so I think it's about education and conversations and dialogue and, personal responsibility, and, just having those conversations about where do we want to be? Where do we want to be? Because, this whole planet is our entire responsibility,
Yeah.
and where we're going to be without it.
Yeah. Elena?
Yeah, well, I just immediately thought of what we saw when COVID first hit, and much of the globe went into lockdown. And what did we see in the air? We started to see the pollution immediately clear. I remember seeing pictures of India. They showed the before, and we saw our environment sort of heal very, very quickly from a reduction in our consumption. And even when you look at what happened to the oil companies, when they weren't able to empty out their barrels, it hit them really hard. So our consumption is what is driving many of the challenges that we're facing. And I heard many people say after they saw sort of, wow, look at what being on lockdown has done for the environment, say, I'm going to make some changes when we start to come out of this. And yet for many of us, we just went right back to our stress-filled lives. And, but maybe some of us did make some changes. But I think in terms of how we vote, who we vote in, looking at all the policies that impact, that's obviously very critical. But, if we don't use it, that's our buying power, I think, is the strongest.
Yeah.
Or
thank
not
you.
buying power in this case.
Thank you. You've both mentioned this idea that this, I think, key value in Indigenous communities of looking at the future and thinking about future generations. And I had an Indigenous leader ask me a few years ago, sort of in a larger meeting, what kind of ancestor do you want to be? And I think those of us who heard that, we were just have found that such a profound question and a profound shift in how you think and how you think about the decisions you might make when you are thinking about future generations. And I think that's a real gift of sort of perspective and a way of thinking that a lot of Indigenous communities have given to us. With that, I think we're going to close, and I want to thank you, Alina and Arminia, for joining us, and especially Alina for getting up truly at the crack of dawn for this webinar. It's been an incredible conversation, and I know it's been very thought-provoking and inspiring for me. I want to thank everyone who joined us, and especially those who stayed on for our after party. Really happy that so many people were able to stay on. As you sign off, please do take our very short survey. And as I said, it's very helpful for us in designing these webinars. As always, stay well, be safe, and take our Blue Marble quiz. And I hope to see you on the next Reimagined in America webinar. Thank you. Bye-bye.